Okay, we're going to get started. And I'm just going to comment really quickly as we move into Neola. I'm sorry, I don't have my schedule in front of me. Just for the time, because we have some very important topics that warrant discussion, and I want to make sure my colleagues have enough time to get some substance before we have a meeting this evening at 6. So we have Neola, Mr. Young, and Ms. Edwina Oliver, and I know we have a lot of policies to go through, so I'm going to stop talking and kick it over to you as we move forward.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, school board members, and our acting superintendent, Mr. Renoff. I'm Edwina Oliver, the Neola project lead for our district. I want to take a few minutes to share with our community and our employees a little background about this project. This project requires our school board members and district staff to review our current school board policies and procedures, which guide the work we do here in the district, to ensure we stay focused on the big picture, student achievement and learning at their highest level, while supporting all staff from around this district who are involved in this work. Neola is the company which we have partnered with on this journey to continue educational excellence. Neola provides us with the policy templates to ensure that the quality of teaching and learning and provide direction to enhance our current school environments. Most importantly, that our policies are aligned with ever-evolving laws and regulations from all levels of government, which include the state, federal, and the Office of Civil Rights. Joining me today to facilitate this work session with our school board members is Mr. Tom Young and Mrs. Frankie St. James from our Neola Associates. Mr. Young.
Thank you, Edwina. Thank you, Edwina. Board members, superintendent, counselor. This is the beginning of a process for you. Your staff has been involved in this process for some time, but this is your first opportunity to actively participate in it. We are going to be working today on board bylaws. A few preparatory comments, if you might. Board bylaws are not required by law. You don't have to have any. I know of no boards in Florida that don't have any. Board bylaws describe your way of work. They demystify the process for the public. It's a set of rules and describes the process by which you make decisions. None of these bylaws are required by law. All of the bylaw templates that we provided to you are warranted by Neola to be in compliance with federal and state law and State Board of Education rules. So if you choose a template to adopt, you can be assured that it is in compliance with federal and state law. Again, you're not required to select any of these, but the policy templates that we've provided are consistent with the law and are consistent with best practices that are utilized by other boards in the state of Florida. I understand that you've had copies of these templates for some time since before the holidays, so you've had a chance to review them. Madam Chair, the way we typically work is, and it is subject to your and the board's approval for this way of work, we typically ask the board whether you have any questions or comments concerning any of the templates that have been provided to you, and we work seriatim, starting with the very first ones in your book. And if you have, by the way, there are a number of policies which I'm sure you've noticed have blanks. We'll need to fill in those blanks today. A number of them have choices. The choices are indicated by parentheticals at the beginning of a particular statement. The parentheticals give you an opportunity to choose one or another, or neither. They're not required. Nothing here is required. So, With that having been said, board members, do you have any questions or comments concerning the way of work? Madam Chair, I'll proceed when you authorize me to do so.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us. I do appreciate that there's a couple different ways, and I think giving them in advance, I think also just especially as we go forward in this whole process, having the policies in advance in a virtual setting or where you have the numbers marked, which we have. I think that these ones. No, this one didn't. Where each line is numerically listed. I think having done this a couple of times, it makes it easier when we have a board member or even a member of staff recommend this change, we're able to quickly get to that line. I think that when it comes to I think that just streamlines it, makes it more efficient. And then the final part, and this is more just mechanical, is having track changes at the end before adoption. That always seems to be an issue of saying what draft is this, which version is this, and I think that's very important. It allows very clear direction to all board members that what version is being presented and what's being finally adopted. I think that's again. As far as bylaws, I'm very encouraged to see this. This is something I know I have brought forward for some time. That is important for the board, while as you noted, not required. I think as a board and a working governing body, being able to agree upon the procedures and practices of which we agree as a governing body to move forward makes it much more efficient. So I am excited about that. I want to start with other board members. Any questions or process-wise before we move forward, or any thoughts? No? Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead. Mr. Duggan.
May I just ask, I just have a couple legal questions for them.
Go.
I just want to ask, I have not been familiar, or I have not been involved with this process, so I might be jumping in late to this, but I'm curious if these policies are written specifically for Florida law?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And my second question is, you said that if we adopt these policies that we can basically guarantee that they're going to be best practices and lawful. Do you offer any type of indemnification for that? And if modifications to the policies are made, how does that work? If you could explain that. Thank you.
Good question. Yes, sir. Madam Chair, Neola is the only company that provides this service that warrants that its policies are in compliance with federal and state law and OCR rules and regulations. In the event that a policy template is adopted by the board and is challenged, Neola will assist the board in defending the policy as being in compliance with federal and state law. The question of changing the templates, to the extent that the changes proposed and adopted by the board are substantive, the most substantive of which would be, for example, substituting a current policy, or in this case, bylaw, for the proposed template, Neola does not warrant those. You do, Mr. Duggan. So there is a question of degree then. If the template or policy or bylaw is substantially changed, then those changes made by the board are warranted by the board. The language which is Neola's unchanged is warranted by Neola.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay?
Sorry, so just one more thing, and I remember when we were discussing Neola or staying with NEFAC, and just for my board members, NEFAC was the former organization that provided our updates with legislative updates. I will admit it was clunky. There was not a very good streamlined process that was both on an internal standpoint and perhaps just the aspect. So where we are now, but my question is, because this is a lot of, Dr. Oliver can attest to, is a lot of work from the staffing standpoint, so that it makes sense from the implementation. And I appreciate the work. I actually need to be vetted as to where we are from a staff standpoint. But when we tweak them in accordance with what Sarasota County is seeking for policies, whatever they may be, bylaws or policies, of course, being compliant with federal, state, and board rules, if we substantively change that, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I'm clear, that it would require our board attorney to sign off, not Neola.
Yes, that is correct. Substantive changes, changes in the meaning of the language. But if your language changes are not substantive in nature, then there's not going to be an issue about the warranting of it. And I might comment about the updates that you mentioned. One of the advantages of staying as close to the Neola template as possible is when Neola issues updates, and we do twice a year as part of the contract that you've entered into with us. In addition to those twice a year, if we have special updates that are required, like the Bill of Rights was a special update that came out and was effective before our next update was to come out a year and a half ago. That special update came out, and there were about 30 policies that needed to be changed as a result of that. If there is an emergency update that is necessary because there is a case or a federal regulation or DOE rule that comes out subsequent to legislative sessions, which has an effective date which precedes the next update, we do an emergency update. So you'll get, and those are not additional costs. So you'll get all of those, and all of those updates update the language which is in your template, so that when the update comes in, we give you a template with the language in the template changed to comply with the changes in the law or the rule. The more your adopted policy differs from the template, the more difficult it is to find where to put the language. So it's just a caveat for you as that goes. And I apologize for going on a little bit there, but both the chair and the attorney gave me an opening to talk
That's
a little
okay.
bit about updates.
No, and I know, I think it's important. This is a new process and new vendor. If there are, please go ahead.
Just one follow-up. So what I think I'm hearing you say is you warrant the language as long as there's not substantial changes. Now, is there, I imagine as part of this process, there's a document that we each sign that was kind of binds us to an agreement to that extent, like an
Yes.
indemnification provision or a warranty or that type of thing?
Yes, that is contained in the contract that you entered into at the beginning of this process.
Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Oliver, can you give us an update where we are on the overall process? I'll start with the bylaws are very important. I have my own thoughts, but I also want to hear from the board members. But before we go into that, because the policy seed, which is required, want to see where we are from the staff and overarching process that you've been working on.
Okay, well, I will say this. Our district staff has been working diligently since October. Really in August, they had a training. Our district staff all had trainings. The Neola associates came. We trained over 2 days on how to access the templates, how to go into Board Doc, how to make changes in editing. And then we went through a process where we were assigning district staff members, executive board members, and within their departments, certain policies that they would work on and to revise and review. So since then, we've had working sessions. Our next working session is January 23rd and the 24th. We'll come with the district staff. At that time, we will be reviewing sections 1, 3, and 4. There are 9 sections to the Neola process of revising the policies. In Section 1, it's the administrative. Section 2 is the Section 3 is the instructional staff. And Section 4 is the support staff. That mainly included all of the HR as well as our finance team. And they're looking at those 3 levels of employment, people that we have in our district that are working, administrative, instructional, and support staff, and how we're doing that. So that team has been working very hard, and they are ready to go to review with the Neola associates. So we'll review the edits that they've made. Mr. Young and the other associates will tell us where we're aligned with the language and making sure that we're on track and that we're following the policies. So we'll do that January 23rd and the 24th. And then we're going to come back in February to review those edits with you as a board. Then we'll be, while they're doing that, we have our teams that are working on sections 2, 5, and 6. 2 is the programs, our curricular programs from the elementary, middle, and high school. Section 5 is student services, and section 6 are finances, our lovely fun topic we like to talk about. But that will be reviewed with you all again in March. In between February and March, we work as a team with our Neola associates to review the edits. So we look at our contract language with SCTA to make sure that what we're practicing in our district is what we're actually writing in our policies, which we then look at the templates to make sure that they're aligned. So that's a little like a triangular effect that we do. But I have to say the process has really, really been good. It's been a learning process, and our district staff members have been very committed to it. Many of them were working over the winter break on their policies, and they do reach out to me and ask questions, and our team, the Neola associates, are very much available, literally 24 hours. We call, we ask questions, we problem solve together, we work it out, and they advise us. At the end of the day, we make decisions based on what we currently are doing in our district, which aligns with our bargaining that we have with SCTA to make sure that all of that we're all aligned in that piece. And then the last 3 sections we will be ready to present to you in April, which is sections 7, 8, and 9. They deal with property, operations, as well as the relations that we work around the district. So we'll deal with those policies toward April, and then we'll be ready to go so that we can review these with you as a board, get them approved, and be ready to go by July 1st, 2023, because that's when NEFAC will end. We will cover with NEFAC until June 30th, 2023.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
May I? What have been the challenges, or what's working better with Neola?
I can't speak to what we've done in the past because I wasn't in this position or responsible, but I will tell you what's working best that I hear from our district staff is the availability that we have with Neola and the fact that they all have the ability to edit. So when we do our changes in there, we track them. You can actually go in and see who was the last person in that policy, and it directs us. We're able to put, okay, Ms. Rose, we need you to go and review this policy. I've made some changes, but now we need Ms. Rose to go in. What has also worked is that we do have a Teams file that we only have with the Neola. And so in that, I update that file quite often to see where we are, who's assigned, what we need to do. And what I like about it is that each of the department heads or our executive directors, they are communicating with each other. They'll look at a policy that says, I don't think this one is falling underneath me. We found that many of our policies are covered, and Mr. Young can help me with this, many of our policies are covered in a lot of different sections. Like one policy can be in 3 different sections with the Neola templates. And so that has been a difficulty, streamlining it to get it where it will be in the right section, in the right policy, so that we're covered. That's been like the difficulty. So sometimes you'll have 3 to 4 staff members working on one policy when we're thinking it's in one section, but in fact, it's really in another section, but we need everyone together on that. And we did that when we did sections 1, 3, and 4. We had Anita Barnes in there with Al Hereda, with Allison Foster, with Danielle Schwei. We were all in there working with Lynn Peterson because we had policies that covered our administrative instruction and support staff, but all of that, about sick days and FMLA, all of that was all covered with all 3 of those groups of district staff members and people around our community that work. So that's been the challenge, but it's been something that we've worked through, and they can attest to it. When we've sat in the room and had our powwows, they'll say, okay, this was good. I'm glad we were all together because we asked questions of each other, and we always say, what are we doing? What's our past practice? What do we have on paper? What are we actually doing? And is it aligned? And that is what we've been finding out. And a few times we've looked, well, we don't have policies in place for certain things that we need to in our district have for our employees. So that's been the good part about it.
Thank you.
Okay, and that is a wonderful aspect and overview of highlighting it. I think it's important to note where those areas of improvement are even for us to help just going forward. Mr. Edwards.
My first question is when, and I discussed this at the board level before, will we have a search function to be able to find the correct policy?
Yes.
Oh,
A word search,
Perfect.
yes. It'll tell you which policies that word appears in, that subject appears in, and if and when you develop procedures, that word search will also identify the procedures which implement the policy which is in question. And if you use the process to establish forms that would go with the implementation of the policy and the procedures, those forms will also be searchable through the word search process.
And does that require us to have Word docs instead of Novus?
I'm not sure.
Word docs, sorry.
Everything is on board docs.
Okay. So that,
Ms. St. James is my technical reference. She is fond of saying to the staff, if you have any technical questions, do not call Tom Young.
okay, so I guess what, I mean, the search function is important from
Sure.
my perspective, because I can't find anything
Understood.
when I'm looking for it, and then
Yeah.
I have to sort of spend a fair amount of time
Yes.
trying to get asked the right questions. So, and I'm not sure that we don't have board docs, is that correct? So is that an expense that we're looking at? Am I
No.
missing something?
The board docs platform is part of Neola's.
Oh, so
It is.
it's coming.
It is. You will be able to access it at no additional cost.
Oh, that's like a Happy New Year. Will that replace Novus? Will we no longer need Novus?
Only this would deal only with policy.
Okay. Okay. All right. Fair enough. And lastly, I just want to say, I did get this packet of bylaws. I had no idea. I saw it was an agenda item, but I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. So I did honestly peruse them. I did not read them because I didn't know why I was reading them, and that I just thought it would be a waste of time if I didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. So I don't know where to go with this now, because I appreciate what you're doing and getting our staff doing, but what is it that you're asking us to do? Because if we had to, I'm afraid to try and figure out how to talk about all these up here.
Well, if I may, because I shared that, it was, the train had left the station, and I don't know that the board was included in that, and that was including me, because I think these were scheduled before, and so I was notified that it was coming, and so my whole point was, get these to board members as much as in advance as possible, and again, my biggest thing is making sure, as I mentioned, that it be in a format that, having gone through this before, was in that electronic, et cetera, moving forward. I scanned through them as well. I think this is important because, again, I don't know how long in advance they had this scheduled, but it was brought to my attention that this was it and this was the time. But there's more structural aspect that I want to make sure all the board members, I mean, it's not even new, it's just that because this is a newer thing, and I'm not sure that it was clearly communicated to the board in totality, including myself. With that said, to be best use of time, I did read through these, but I have my own opinion. They're very detailed, and I think in my mind, even bylaws, and this is just for my board, bylaws, while not as mentioned, not required, I think they do help just the normal organizational structure so that there aren't disagreements in the moment. It's just more seamless, but the words do matter very, very importantly. And so just making sure that the mechanics are one thing, but understanding, what everyone's comfortable with. So with that, also then, as Dr. Oliver brought forward, where we are as an overall organization, the district, and what the expectations are, what we can expect coming forward. So with that, because we have them here, I think, Mr. Edwards, your point's well taken. I'm not sure if other board members had the opportunity to read through every single thing. And the first 5 in my mind are pretty standard, but again, I want to make sure board members, and this is going to be in any project of the policy aspect, that we read through it carefully. And I really do encourage, and I would ask Neola that if you can provide these and going forward in an electronic format once it's completed through the staff feedback, in a numerical line item so that board members can see that? Is that something you're able to do?
Not on board
Not
docs.
on board docs.
It's not that way. We can give you access to board docs. So we can assign you, I can assign you a user ID and a password for you to go in. And it's very organized on board docs by each section. And you hit the section and it opens up all of our policies. Right now, when they show it to you, and Ms. Frankie will show it to you, it's going to show you how the board doc looks, where we're all in working, the district staff, where we're working on our current policies and editing them. And you'll see how we're tracking them. And I'm hoping she'll be able to show you that piece of it. But when I think you asked previously, could we do the electronic version of them? It's really no way with board docs you can. It's an online platform, but there's not even a way for me to do a PDF and send to you.
No, okay. So wait, but electronic, I mean, it's on the platform.
Oh,
so-
absolutely.
However, I want to make sure before we do that, and this is not for the bylaws, for the policies, that it is, you have the frames completed with the staff and the legal updates, and then where each board member argue, and I don't know, I mean, please guide me if you've done this before, where each board member has a color that when you do track changes, if Mr. Edwards or Mrs. Rose wanted shall versus may, right? That's a very big one, it makes a big difference, but just so that allows the process when we discuss it to be more streamlined during those meetings. Is that doable?
Well, okay, first, there is not a, board docs does not provide a platform where the lines are numbered. It does not.
Okay.
Second, when we provide you with the templates which are revised and recommended to you for your consideration by the superintendent and his staff, your responsibility would be to review them and to note questions and identify areas where changes would be made, but you would not be making the modifications yourselves individually. When we come together as a board in this collaborative process, individual board members would raise a question or make a suggestion about a change which would come up on the screen for all of us to see so everyone knows what we're talking about. And you would develop, as a chair, you would perceive the evolution of a consensus on a particular subject, and then we would move on. You wouldn't be voting on it because it's a workshop, and we're not adopting policies. So even today, for example, when we talk about the bylaws, it sounds like we won't finish them today. That's okay. We will come back, and once today's session is over, the process will become a little more clear about how board members can respond to raise questions about, make it district specific, if you will. The timelines here are yours. The dates, the agenda, Madam Chair, are yours. Now, we had set these dates up a long time ago. Those dates can be changed if the board is not comfortable with those dates. But we have found that if you don't have dates set in advance, there is something that you can work towards that has an end. If there isn't, our experience, we've all been in education, our experience is priorities change. And if you don't have a deadline, things get moved back. So that the board workshops give staff a deadline against which to work.
I could not agree more. And also, as far as the changes, I think just the line numbers, again, having gone through this a couple times, it made it quick and seamless, but that is, I mean, we'll work through that. If Mrs. Tompkins, can you email all the board members, whatever the previously agreed timelines? I agree that when you have a set in stone date frame, there are moving, all sorts of things come at us at various reasons, but that way the entire board will have clarity as to the process as well, or the timeframes. With that, I mean, we're here. If we have any additional questions, you want to go line by line, how would everyone like to proceed? Go ahead, Mrs. Marinelli.
Well, being a new board member, when I was reading this last night, and I have to admit I was reading it while I was watching the football game, but I what helped me the most, and I think probably because I was in education, that I zeroed in on, was the behaviors of board members and what we are to do and not to do, and what we are to interfere with and not interfere with, and what our responsibilities are and are not. So that's going to be very helpful for me, not only to gauge my own behavior, but when something is not quite going well with us five up here, we'll be able to make reference to it in a very respectful manner. So thank you for that. That was very helpful for me.
That's much of the intent, yes. Thank you for those comments.
Seeing none other, I don't know, I mean, so if I were to go through definitions, definitions, the name, which is a very easy one, we can satisfy I think these are the ones we can satisfy. We'll discuss a seal, responsibilities and authority of the board, and then board powers. This is probably the first five. I think when we get into the standards of boardmanship, that does require very meticulous reading for board members, and if you didn't have the opportunity to, I think we just not waste time to fumble through it, because I want to give everyone the opportunity to really understand each word, what that means, does that represent where we stand, and perhaps we just go back to that one. I think that would make more sense, because I think that one is pretty, although it's not long, I think there's a little bit more in there. And let me see where else I marked. My cheat sheet is not. So let's start with those ones from the sake of time. I think officers is pretty basic. I think, well, the board staff communication, I'd love to get to that today. That may require some tweaking, but let's do it that way. Does that work for everyone? Mr. Edwards, go ahead. Sorry. Or is that from previous?
I honestly didn't come prepared to,
Okay.
I didn't come prepared to execute to a decision today, because I didn't know, like I said,
Same. Yep.
what that was. So if I may, suggest that, because I think the self-imposed deadline here is July.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's self-imposed.
And so what we have is bylaws that we have to get through, and then policy conversations. I might suggest that we divide these bylaws up in workshop dates, so that there's X amount that we have to be responsible for coming prepared to at a workshop to discuss. I don't care how many that is, so that we make a July deadline, and then make sure that we're available to know how many policy reviews you're going to send our way on a monthly basis, so that we're prepared to discuss bylaws and the appropriate policies, so that all of that comes together at the self-imposed deadline of July.
That works for me. No, I think that's great, and that's what we've done previously. If Mrs. Tompkins can, again, send that over so we can disseminate it and work, kind of reverse engineer it. And then as board members, the bylaws, while it looks lengthy, it's not too much. But I agree. I think this was predetermined, and
Madam Chair, if I might, to give you an idea of the amount of time that is involved in this, some school boards, we now have, I think, 39 or 40 school boards in Florida. Some of those school boards have done the bylaws in one workshop, 2 hours. At the other end of the extreme, and I will not name the board, it took 5 3-hour workshops for them to do the bylaws by themselves before they ever got to policies. And a caveat for your information. You've entered into a contract with Neola which specifies a specific number of face-to-face hours with us. If you exceed the number and have not completed the process, there is an additional charge, and the charge is not insignificant. But it is to all of our benefits to come as prepared as possible, and I understand completely Mr. Edwards' position here. It is the first session, and we were perhaps remiss in not making it clear when we scheduled this what was expected of the board. The board will now have a better understanding of this in the future and what's expected of them. So this first session will be slower than usual, I suspect, because the board was not fully aware of what was expected of them as they walked in the door to deal with this.
Or even the previous, yeah, go ahead. Well, I am aware of that. I think that, again, I read through this, I think that, as I noted, there are a couple of them that I think probably are unlikely to be determined today. I think they are something that each person should go back and review them, and not to waste time on back and forth. I think having some framework. There are ones that I think are truly mechanical, not philosophical in any way, shape, or form. And if given the contract that is noted, if we're able to at least achieve some of those today, we're at least moving the ball forward. That would be my recommendation. Again, I know we have two very time-specific follow-up meetings, and then we have a very important discussion at the workshop. So for that purpose, but I completely agree with where you're coming from and don't want to put that position on anyone. So like I said, if I were to highlight which ones those are, there's a handful, but the first five, I think, again, are very mechanical. Mrs. Rose?
Agreed. I wholeheartedly agree. Some of them are mechanical, some of them need dialogue, but they are at face value your options within there. And I would also look to legal counsel to be advising us when those options exist.
And I will add, just again, I think definitions, while at face value, please read through those as well. I think signing off on those, I'm going to highlight areas, please, and please bring yours too. If there's any nuance where you feel like you don't have an opportunity, because this is important and it's for everybody. If there's anything in there, if it is not truly just a simple mechanical thing, we will set it aside and go back to it. Okay? Is that fair, everyone? So I think definitions, while at face value, we want to read through those and make sure that those are agreeable, unless you wanted Ed to bring in any comments forward.
Those definitions will change as we add to them throughout the process. And there may be some district-specific definitions which would be different from those which are in there. I think the definitions are the last thing you need to consider
Okay,
at
very
this
good.
point.
So then, again, assuming everyone has not shuffled their papers around, I have the name, that is 0111, and please, I mean, would you like to direct this, or however?
Yes, normally Mr. Young is the one
Then
who
go
would
ahead,
direct it.
please.
I'm happy if you'll start, where is it? Okay. By the way, the name is not as simple as it appears. Different districts name themselves differently. Some call themselves, for example, in Sarasota, it would be the Sarah County School District, the School Board of Sarasota, the School Board of Sarasota School District. It depends on how you are, how you have your official name, and we don't know. I don't know what your official name is for what when you have contracts that are entered into.
Mr. Renoff, do you have the documentation as far as our legal or Mr. Duggan?
I was always just under the impression it was the School Board of Sarasota County.
But for example, you have behind you Sarasota County Schools. So we weren't sure how you call yourself officially.
Well, so my recommendation would be based on whatever our legal document defined registered
Right.
name is.
Yeah, we probably need to go back and look at however this was set up initially. I don't know offhand. I wouldn't want to guess.
Okay, and then because, I mean, alternatively, if we do not like the way it sounds, we can amend it certainly as board members, but then there will be certainly a fair amount of paperwork potentially behind that, but, all right, so then is that what, tasking the general counsel to identify that, or? Yes. Okay.
What do you have up on the screen now, Frankie? Okay. So we're going to move on? Okay. Next one, next number. And if you can make that any bigger, Frankie. Okay. Then I'll need to put it on my screen as well.
Our screen is flickering. I'm not sure. Is that a platform or? It is not.
I won't be looking at it for long.
Well, I'll get like seasick or motion sickness.
Sorry, it's going like this.
No worries.
Well, I'm just gonna turn that off, and then I've got the paper version.
Paper
So
always
everyone else
works.
in the county can see it. Okay.
We're on now the section, policy 112, the geographical district.
And we are not familiar with whether you are
Don't
single-member
have 112.
districts
I go
or,
from 111.
Yeah, they're front and back.
Got it, thank you.
Yep.
You're welcome. Got to save paper. Is everyone there? Mr. Duggan, do you know our geographic district? Are we?
Yeah, I believe it's the county.
It is. Yes,
Okay.
Sarasota County.
All right, you got that, Ms. Frankie? All right.
Okay.
Okay, so,
Can she mic? I can't.
oh, let me mic her.
oh, we can skip over the geographical district, I think. And we can skip over the address. We'll put that in for you. The law does require that the school board adopt a seal. We assume that you have done so. That's behind you.
Yes, that was done 3 years ago. 2018.
So again, we can deal with these without having, as you point out, they're technical. There need not be discussion on these items that we're talking about now. That's 0114, the seal. The next one, 018, is the purpose of the board. That may require some discussion. There is nothing in this which is written in concrete. This is typical of what many boards use, but many boards make it much more brief than this. So this is something which I commend for your consideration. Madam Chair, you may want to set this one aside and discuss it later.
This would be one, again, being out of fairness to my colleagues, so that they aren't reading
Sure.
on the fly, and because
Yeah.
I think these are important. So that would be one that board members, I would flag, so you take the time to read it, so that it has and reflects the language and goals that work for you, and if any changes, we can do that at the next scheduled one.
0121 is the responsibilities and authority of the board. It is 2 sentences. It is intended to be non-controversial, but I've learned never to make an assumption about what is controversial and what is not. So we present that for the board's consideration. I will tell you, this comes right out of statute, as do many of these policy or procedural and bylaws. The language comes right out of the statute.
Well, and that's my point. I feel like that That's why we have legal counsel, and, you know, even when I look at the one we just passed by and I started and folded the corner down, I'm going to be calling legal counsel to see what is statute in there and what isn't. So I almost feel like we need, I don't know how this is streamlined. I want to make sure, I don't want it to be about what I think, I want it to be about what is the best legal decision.
Yeah, I'd have to look at everything closer, but in my cursory look of this packet here, it seems like much of it is just a pure statement of what the Florida statutes actually say. And
That's
it's just in a
correct.
more organized manner.
Then what's there to think about?
Well, the question is, do you want to have this in your bylaws or not? And I would suggest to you that, as the chair suggested, one of the advantages of having bylaws is not only do the bylaws give the board an understanding as a collegial body of what their obligations and individual responsibilities are, it also demystifies the process and educates the public. So by this statement, the public understands what the responsibilities and authority of the board is, and that it's statutory.
Mr. Young, and I apologize to everyone, just for clarification, because I think this was partially done with members of the former board, and so there's an element of nuance. And for looking ahead purposes.
Correct.
For looking ahead purposes, is it something you, with the relationships or contracts you have with other boards across the state, do you work with the district general counsel as a starting point, or?
It varies board to board. There is no rule, there is no guideline in our contract. Some attorneys do not get involved until the material is presented at a workshop. Some attorneys, John McClure, for example, in Highlands County, sat in on every staff meeting with the staff. Now, there's a lot of billable hours involved in that. But it's totally up to the district how they use their attorney and how involved the attorney is in this process, and when he or she becomes involved.
I have one question.
Yes, please.
So some of these, in looking at this, some of these, the school board already has a policy on, and I don't see anything wildly inconsistent with my basic understanding of our current policies are, but in other districts, what's the process to, once these are implemented, to go back and see if we need to fix any inconsistencies with our board policies? How do other places handle that?
Okay, that's a good question. Without exception, every other board that we have worked with reviews all of the policy templates and makes suggested proposed changes and revisions as they deem appropriate, while they review our template and their current policy. During this process, they review your current policy and our templates on the same subject, and they decide whether or not the Neola template serves the purpose better than or not as well as your current policy. When you adopt, when you substitute a policy, which is your current one, with which you are satisfied, for the Neola template of the same subject, we give it the number that the Neola template had, and we move your policy into that number. That number then becomes your attorney's warrant that it is in compliance with the law. Neola does not. And when there is an update on that particular policy, the update is of the language that is in the Neola template. So it's going to be more challenging to move the language that was required by the change in the statute into your policy than it would be into our template.
Real quick, and who would be pulling, who is tasked, because where I look at Neola or NEFAC, there was process of review, and then there was some breakdown of review, then updated to the policy booklet. So there's an administrative element. Obviously, we are in a moment of transition from a leadership standpoint, wherever that goes. But when we're talking about moving forward, I mean, to not duplicate efforts here, where we have a policy X and then Neola policy is A, and they cover the same thing, who, in your experience, and I get, you can say it is different with each district, and certainly I understand that, but there are best practices and procedural elements. Is it the board that's running ship? Is it a member of the administration? So that when these are coming up, they're lining up, and it could be Dr. Oliver, certainly you could be you. Is that, so when those come forward, is that you that's going to be, okay.
Yes, Madam Chair, that is me.
So you
Okay,
would bring
and
up our old
typically-
policies and then our new one, and that's, and again, I'm sorry if I'm being redundant, but that's where you go to staff and ask them X, Y, and Z, does this make sense? Where do we have opportunities?
Yes, ma'am. That's what they do in their work sessions. That's what we've been doing since August when we had our first work session. We had one in October. We rescheduled it because of the hurricane, and then we came back. The team came back, as he stated, and we worked through that. We pull up the current board policies. We look at, even if it's been changed with NEFAC, some things have been already updated because of NEFAC. We've had to update some things. That's the most recent policy. That's where we start. And then we look at the template for Neola and we see, okay, is this here? And the very good thing about it is we look at specific language to our district. If we want specific language to our district, we don't want to part with it. It really does support what we're trying to implement. We keep that. And then that's when Mr. Young and then Mr. Dugan will say, okay, yes, it works, or it will work. So he's been very good about saying, that's not going to fly, because if we take out this one thing from a current policy, it may be something that the state's requiring, and we want to take it out because it's not in there. We won't do that. He'll say, no, that must stay in there because it's state required, state statute. So that's what our district staff has been working through behind the scenes. So when you received your bylaws, the templates form, like some of them, like you stated, are very simple. It's not just a matter of language and what you want to do about it. That's what the review process is. So it's almost like current policies for the bylaws, and then having these, what do we want to keep, what do we want to change, and making sure that it stays within the law, because that's the big piece.
Well, may I?
Well, Mr. Edwards, and then you, Mr. Edwards. You were queued again. I think that was current.
I want to just say, I feel like we're going in a bunch of different directions here, and I think that we experienced a lack of leadership, to use we're in transition of leadership. We had a break. My understanding, and this is having done agenda review, and is that at an agenda review, if Neola's on the agenda, then we should know what we're doing with that, and it gets discussed during an agenda review. But there was a lot of transition, a lot of stuff up in the air. So I feel like we're trying to figure out where to go from here. And when Mrs. Rose started saying she wanted consultation from attorney, we have Mike McKinley, who is an expert at school policy, so that it doesn't have to be a reinvention of the wheel. We might want to have Mr. McKinley in this parts of the conversation. So what I'd like to try and do is, if I may, make a suggestion that we get, because Neola has done this many times, I personally am not looking to spend 5 hours at a clip by any stretch of the imagination. Please do not let that happen.
Okay.
But if you can, so that we're not going round and round and round, make a recommendation of how we should go from, we could close this conversation, and here's what we do at the next 3 workshops. Give us 3, that you need an hour, 15 minutes, whatever it is you need, and tell us where our responsibilities are, and we can, in my opinion, rely on Mr. McKinley's knowledge of statute and all of those kinds of things to get counsel for us as quickly as possible. Those are my suggestions.
Yeah, I would concur, and I know that I have 2 other board members, but I just want to really chime in. I agree, and I think that I'm process-oriented, and again, when I look at historically, we have to define board's role in adoption and be comfortable with the role that our general counsel is signing off on, or the various subject general counsel's experts on that, to be seamless, but also the process of when these, just to illustrate the actual process, who and what, not by names, but by structure. That way, it will not duplicate the disconnect that we saw historically and it dropped off a cliff, and then we find ourselves in the same place. I don't want to do that again. I apologize to you and you, because I know you've invested a lot of time. I apologize there, somehow there has been a lot of or lack of communication. And that being said, looking forward as far as scheduling and time. And I also think that way we can put together, because I think we are trying to squeeze this through, and it's not working. So, but I think to be comfortable that I have two others, but I just want to, that would be my takeaway from this, to have it very clearly. Here's the timeline, here's who runs point on it, and that process of when it comes to the board, the general counsel can finally review it so that we're not duplicating efforts. I have Mrs. Rose, then Mr. Enos, and then Mr. Duggan.
If I might, Madam Chair,
Yes, please.
to Mr. Edwards' point, two quick ones. We have worked with Mr. McKinley in, I can't remember whether it's 5 or 6 different school districts where he has been the school board attorney. He is very familiar with this process and very familiar with Neola. That's number one. Number two, how does the authority work? The statutes read, and I think I'm quoting it verbatim, upon the recommendation of the superintendent, the board shall adopt policy. So what comes to you is a recommendation of the superintendent through his staff of proposed policies for you to consider. You may change them. And that change would occur in an open discussion among the board and a consensus reached on particular policies. But they are initiated by the superintendent. And finally, so that to Mr. Duggan's point, when this process is complete and all policy recommendations of the superintendent have been considered, what we have recommended and what every board has done to this point is at a board meeting, whether it be before July 1st or not, at a board meeting, there will be a motion to adopt the new policies recommended by the superintendent and agreed upon by the board and advertised to the public, and at the same time rescind all current board policies. So there is a swap. There are no conflicts then. The conflicts have been resolved in the discussion between staff, among each other, and then if the board has a question or concern, raised in workshops. But when that final gavel falls, you'll have a whole new set of policies, and your old policies will have been rescinded. I hope that demystifies that a little bit more, Mr. Edwards.
Mr. Enos. I'm sorry, Mrs. Rose.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is very different. I'm looking at, our legal counsel is Shoemaker. Our sitting legal counsel is Attorney Duggan. And I'm looking to him to make the decisions on leading us forward as a board, if indeed there's a need to for Shoemaker and Duggan to bring in other attorneys. They have done so, and I'm sure will do so. I'm most interested in each one of these bylaws of what is the legislative mandate and what is the flex that we are deciding on. For me, that's really all that matters. And what we do with the parts that are flexible, or is every single component a legislative mandate?
There are no legislative mandates that I know that you have any bylaws at all.
I'm not saying have bylaws relative to what Mr. Duggan had said, that
If you look at these policies, a lot of times, and our own policies actually too, if you look at the bottom, there is a cite oftentimes to either a statute or a
That's my
rule, and
point.
sometimes
Right.
numerous
that's
statutes
what I'm
that,
referencing.
that form the basis of the need for the policy.
Correct. That's what I'm saying. If there's a need for the policy and everything in there is answering that reference to what we're supposed to be doing, then what parts of this are flexible for us to decide? That is, for me, where it stops and ends. Where,
Okay, let me clarify, and this may be a distinction without a difference, I'm not sure. But the the statutory reference does not, to me, indicate a need for this particular policy. Let's take the responsibilities 0121. That reference to the statute, FS 1001.40, is the authority for such a bylaw, should you choose to have it.
Yeah, and I think that's, and I want to interject, I want to clarify the difference between our activity today, which is voluntary, but I would say in general, whatever, I'm not speaking to the specific language, but bylaws are a recommended thing for us to unify and vote on while not required by law. And then our policies will always reference a statute and a date of which it was amended. And I'm assuming when we swap, there would be some kind of reflection on our newly Neola stamped policy.
There would be, yes.
Mr. Duggan, and then Mr. Enos.
Yeah, if I may, a practical suggestion, and this is fine if it's Mr. McKinley. He may have even already started on this. I don't know. I know I have not been involved in this, but to me, what makes sense is to get a copy of each of the statutes cited in these policies, the policy itself, and our current policy. We have policies on a lot of these things, and look at each one for each item, look at all three of those things, and this should be done, frankly, by general counsel in consultation with staff, and then we highlight what's the same, what's different, and then we come back to the board with a suggestion of, I think we should go with our current policy, I think we should go with the Neola policy, here's what's different, here's what's the same. To me, that would be the most productive way to do this.
Thank you.
Mr. Enos. I'm good. And that's, I guess, that's what I meant by way of just a process. So overview, big picture, we can see that we know we're not working in just responsive aspect. I want to make sure that every bucket by way of staff is getting, and I have no doubt that's the case, but just to see it, because I think all of us are kind of being brought in after the fact. And so, again, that way it looks at, this is the process, this is a arbitrary timeline. I agree with having those timelines, but that we make sure legal counsel, we have all of those buttoned up. That's just the process, and then we work accordingly. And then provide detailed a overview for our board members when it's being presented. Here's what we did. Here's what is that staff reviewed it. Legal has reviewed this as well. Now we're looking to you for your sign off. Go forth and discuss, and then adopt. Does that sound like a reasonable process?
And I will add, I think there's some utility in adopting to the extent, so what I anticipate in just basically looking at this is a lot of our policies are generally the same on these same topics. There might be little nuances that are different. I think there is some utility in adopting the Neola policy version if it's all the same, so that when the updates come through, then we can just put the updates in a lot easier than trying to recreate the wheel and cram a square peg into a round hole.
I would agree with that, and I mean, again, as long as it reflects where we want to go, and I think that matters. But the final question is, and Mr. Edwards brought this up as well, I remember months ago when we were discussing NEFAC and Neola, I had raised the concern of board docs versus Novus, because we use Novus, and I understand board docs comes with it, but is there a streamlined component for us, staff-wise, if we're all on board docs versus having it partially on board docs and then Novus? Are they completely separate, or is there a streamlined function of updates or anything, agenda items, or, because our agenda is done through Novus, right? So is it just uploaded, or we're doing it? So there's nothing. Okay. All right. You're looking at me like I'm asking a question that's
Well, now,
bizarre. So
remember, I ask you, if you have a technical question, don't ask Tom Young. Ask Frankie. Now,
Okay.
but my understanding is, and Frankie will correct me if I'm wrong, she's not reluctant to do that, there is, the board docs is part of the package. That's the way we do the policies. How you, when you have an agenda, the board docs will be what is presented to you and to the public through the platform. I don't know how there can be a combination with Novus and Neola.
okay. I think offline, I'm going to have to connect with communications, with IT, with CO. I mean, there's just, this is clunkier than necessary. And I apologize to everyone involved because this just seems it's a bit fragmented and it's not any reflection on you by any means. I just I was not part of this project per se once it was approved. So that's where we are. I think we're out of time. This is unless there are additional comments. I know that our contract says a certain amount of time, but I also feel that this is not a productive use of time at this point. I think there's some structural things. Mr. Edwards.
Just for clarification, so I understand, where do we go from here? Because we have a deadline, and I just want to know what we're doing now to get to the next step.
May I, Madam Chair? Mr. Edwards, at this point, we will have to reschedule the board bylaws because we're only dealing with the board bylaws, which the district staff has nothing to do with. This is just how you all will govern yourselves as a board. Now that Madam Chair says that we are going to accept and put in place some bylaws, I think I'm hearing that. So now we have to get back together with a timeline, and so I will get with Ms. Tompkins to get with the board to say, here's the timeline, and here's what we're going to do next, and whether that involves, it sounds like you want to involve Council McKinley in this process. But he will get the same thing. So I may have to go ahead and give him a user ID and access so he can go into Board Docs and look at just the bylaws that are affected with the school board, which is in section 00, because that's the section that we have to go with and work. Our district staff will continue to work in the working sessions that our attorney was just describing. That's exactly what our district staff has been doing behind the scenes, looking at current policies, old policies, looking at them, reviewing them, taking out, tweaking, making sure we're following contract language. That's what we've done as a district staff. I think now that I'm seeing very clearly the process, the breakdown where the process came with the transition and all of that, what you're supposed to do as a board and what we need to do now. So moving forward, I would have a very definitive timeline when it comes to working with the board, so making sure that we are making best use of the time and everyone understands what they have when it comes to the bylaws. So you'll still need to keep the bylaws that you have.
Correct.
And you'll need to review them. And I'll be honest, I think it came up about tracking. There's no way that all 5 of you can go in there and
No,
track at one time.
And I don't think we need
Yeah,
that. I think
right. So
that
it
it's more
yeah.
for policies, and
Yes.
honestly, I don't even need from an amending standpoint.
Yes.
When we've gone through, and yours policies may be more, may not be as lengthy, but in past workshops, it would be which line, which paragraph,
Yeah.
et cetera. That's not something that's offered. It's fine. We'll move forward. I don't
Yep.
need to be laborious on that.
Yep.
I would say that we have these. Each board member can read through these. We don't need, I think we can come together as a board and
Yes,
go
ma'am.
through what we like, what we don't like, as long as the work is done on the front end. And then reconnect, so it won't be a face-to-face. I understand there's a limited contractual aspect of that. I feel comfortable that we'll get through that. Unless no, that's how I see. So next step would honestly be if everyone can do their due diligence of reading these beforehand, and bring it back to the either next month, I have to look at the schedule, next month or March, that we will finalize this and move through the next step.
Okay.
Who on staff, if you know Mr. Renoff, has been working on this on the staff side?
Mr.
That's for me,
Ms.
sir.
Oliver, she's
I'm the
taking
lead on this.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
There's still the issue of the Novus platform and how it will work alongside of this new platform and have policies on one platform and agendas and workshops on the other. That's still up
Yeah.
in the air.
Agreed, and I'm gonna have to sidebar with staff and then make sure that that's provided an update to everyone. Mr. Renoff.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest after this, obviously, allow Ms. Oliver, Mr. Young, and team, maybe with Mr. Duggan and or Mr. McKinley,
Thank you.
and our IT folks on the side have a sidebar about, again, exactly what we've just discussed here today. What's the timeline? Let's take a look at platforms, et cetera. What's the process going to be so that we then can come to all of you, yes, and Ms. Tompkins, of course, so that then we can come back to you and say, here's where we are, here's where we're going forward, here's the timeline, et cetera.
And, Madam Chair, that timeline is not written in concrete. That timeline can be changed by the board if it takes longer than we anticipated, then we'll extend it. Again, the timeline is yours, it's not Neola's.
Right, no, but I think it's reasonable within the next 2 workshops, we can get our bylaws evaluated and discussed. There were some other components, mechanical, as you mentioned. Mr. Renoff, thank you so much for that. And that way, we will update the board as to what that looks like. And with that, unless there are additional comments, I think we'll conclude. Good, all right. Thank you very much.
Board members, we're looking forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, let me go through. So I'm going to, because of that, change some time frames. So but we have Megan Fay joining us at 3 or 3:15, I believe 3:15, or 3 or 3:15. And then we have a executive session at 3:30. Given that we have some unexpected time, then we will move to the interim superintendent discussion and superintendent search. Is everyone, do we need a 5-minute break or anything like that before we, yes, good? Okay. So I first want to say thank you to Mr. Runoff sincerely. You have been tremendously wonderful over the break and during a moment of just incredible communication, and I really, my heartfelt thank you to you. I wanted to, what I wanted to do today is first talk about interim superintendent and some names in general, but also want to make sure we allow ourselves some time to discuss the superintendent search and what we would be looking for. There are a couple decisions that we would need to make and work backwards by way of timeline, whether or not we want to do an RFP, meaning a request for proposal, when it comes to any kind of third-party organization to help us do that search. There is futility in doing that because we do rely on staff, but you also have the board, and so having an independent individual to help with that. There are firms, there are consultants, there's a myriad of different things. Our friends to the north at Manatee County have done an RFI or RFP where they had about 8 different vendors, a whole myriad of different setups. I would say we would want to do one for our own, but again, these are just scenarios I'm putting out to the board since this is the first superintendent search. I believe everyone, but I also know that you've sat through on a different vantage point. But I wanted to make sure we got through some of the main things that are a priority to everyone so that we can hit those buckets and get moving on that, as well as discuss an interim, if there are names being put forward, having a public discussion about that so that we can move forward with that. Finally, because given the time frame, I didn't want to box us in, and I'm not trying to have special meetings unnecessarily because I know that is a challenge for everyone. I know on our workshop agenda, in our board meeting agenda this evening, there is a line item of new business for appointing a superintendent. That really would be contingent upon a couple things that were brought forward today. My reason for that is if there was someone that was recommended, and we'll open it up to dialogue, but I just want to talk structurally here, is if, for example, Mr. Runoff, everyone knew at this board, and when that was done at a very quick moment, however, there may be people being brought forward that not everyone on this board has met, and I don't want to put the board members in a position to make a significant action vote without being accommodated the opportunity to reach out to them, and I don't believe between a workshop and a board meeting would be sufficient for that. So I just wanted to explain that. So for that reason, so I'm going to take this in 2 buckets where we would first discuss interim superintendent, any suggestions or names. I know that all of us have received, a couple of people have brought forward their names and wanted to open the floor to members of the board for any additional discussions on interim superintendent. Mr. Enos?
What my suggestion would be is that any board member has a name that they would like to bring forward, and then I do not believe that, let's say that you brought up somebody that you haven't had an opportunity to talk to them to see exactly where they are with the interest. Is I think that we need to have the opportunity, because of the sunshine, we need to be able to have an opportunity to talk to that person individually to be able to come up with a decision. Because let's say it's somebody that's from outside of the district. Let's say it's somebody from inside the district. Let's say it's somebody that has some interest. I think that we need to have that time. So I think for today, what my suggestion would be is that we bring up the names. Then we unfortunately, we can either, Mr. Renoff is doing a phenomenal job. We could wait to do the actual and give us 2 weeks to make the decision, or we could do a special meeting. I mean, I think there's some stuff that that could happen, because I think in the fairness of everybody and the people that have stepped forward, I know Dr. Foster, Dr. DePillo, both have sent in stuff in regarding to that. Plus, there were some people from outside that have also sent in, which I think that all of the board members have an opportunity to be able to bring forward the name, give us an opportunity to talk to them individually, and then be able to come back whichever the date that the chair believes is, and at that point, then you would do the appointment after the discussion. That would be my request, because I would like to be able to interview people for that without knowing where they stand, if that makes sense.
You echoed exactly my sentiments. Are there any other comments on process or what have you? Mr. Edwards?
I think under the circumstances of what appeared to be a lack of transparency, that the public be given an opportunity to weigh in on their thoughts of how we should name an interim superintendent. I think it's unrealistic for us at this particular point in time to make those decisions on our own, and that under the circumstances of lack of trust, all of the things that I don't really need to go into to antagonize my fellow board members, but we have some work to do here in the community that requires their input. So before we establish a procedure for naming the interim, I think we get community input.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? I'm actually going to comment on that. I appreciate, and I do want to hear from members of the community. We are talking about an interim. I think that stability and moving forward is really our focus, and really moving to the process of our more permanent superintendent, engaging the community in that aspect. I think we have to take some decisions as leaders and who are elected in this position. However, that, as I mentioned before, with the interim selection, being fair to my colleagues and all of us, not knowing what or who, that this is the opportunity to discuss, bring forward those names, discuss and take maybe perhaps action at the board meeting with those names as individuals on record that are interested and have come forward, and providing the public the clear awareness of who those people are, and then whether it be a special meeting or on February, I believe it's 7th. And I did bring this forward to Mr. Renoff as just as a timeline aspect before I brought this forward, that I thought that was the most transparent way and affording the board a opportunity to reach out to whomever either has already come forward, or if there are other board members that have other individuals. So that would be my recommendation. I know Mr. Edwards has a different point of view, and and obviously we can't vote on anything, but I do need to hear from board members so that we can move forward procedurally. Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's imperative, as all boards preceding us have done, is to get a interim superintendent in place. I'm quite confident that this board can do this, and we are taking our time. I don't think this is an appropriate venue for narratives of distrust or the otherwise. I think it's a time to come together and model unity, and everyone on this board has the opportunity to bring up a name. There's been two individuals that have submitted their interest in serving us in this transition as interim, and other names are welcome, that we can each go and talk to these individuals and come back together and make the decision that we were elected to do so.
Wonderful. And well, just for clarity, Dr. Foster and Dr. DePillo are both members of our staff, wonderful members of our staff, and so for the public listening, they have brought their names forward, and we really appreciate their willingness to step up. Just again, since we have I know they sent that email to us, but that's hasn't been available to the public, and I want to make sure that they are privy to that information. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. I just want to try to keep things on a particular level. We wouldn't be in this situation if we had been demonstrating unity. And so what I'm trying to get to is a procedure that doesn't necessarily follow what previous boards have done. I'm not trying to create an uncomfortable venue. What I am trying to do is create a procedure for unity, which is to allow the public, whoever they may be, from whatever side of the aisle they may be from, to give input to this board on how to name an interim, because the interim, in my opinion, is going to be just as responsible as the new superintendent to lead through healing, lead through calmness, lead through direction with the chair on agenda. All of those things are going to be essential. And that's why, before we start banting names around, I think it's fair, under the circumstances, because there is a perception that this board did not listen to the community, the majority of the community, and they furthered the division. So in order to get on the other side of that hurdle, I am suggesting that the community be given the opportunity to weigh in on how the board should name the interim.
Thank you for that. Again, so we've had an agenda item on the board out there for the public, and we will, I hope to have public comment today. I'm sure that this is of high interest. I know that the Herald Tribune has also covered it as far as a general overview, just high level, and I look forward to hearing from members of the public this evening as far as any feedback they want to provide. Moving forward from a standpoint of, again, hearing from members of the board, I think it would be beneficial to be either prepared tonight or today to bring forward. I wanted to mention the two that of our staff members that have come forward to step up in the interim. If there are no additional discussions on that, then I will move to the overview of just some items that we need to make decisions on as far as the search. Did you look like you were trying to press? You can always go like this. Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think well, first I'd like to thank Mr. Renoff. I think he's done an incredible job. He has brought stability to the district over the last several weeks. I've had several staff members express that. I have had people from the community express that. And I think it's only fair too, yes, we have gotten feedback, but it also depends on who that feedback is from. I feel very confident with the people that are within our district. I've been with this district a long time, and I've seen many superintendents come and go. And two of the most successful that we've had, Wilma Hamilton and Lori White, came from within, that were appointed by the school board at that time. I feel very confident with the names that have been given to us that we can discuss. We can get community input at the 6 o'clock board meeting, but I feel very confident that I know I, as a board member, can make a decision, because I think it's vital to move forward, and we need to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional comments? So again, in an effort to move forward, that this evening under new business is interim, really an action item, absent would really be, in my mind, would be to bring forward the names, and like I said at a workshop here, that these are the two that I have, unless there are other board members that had anyone else, this would be the ideal time. Certainly you can wait till the board meeting, but in an effort to put it out there and give the board an opportunity to know, and the public know who that is, then ideally my recommendation would be that we add on the February 7th meeting to appoint that superintendent. The only other item that we do need to discuss as a board, if there's any change, would be the compensation of the interim superintendent. I'm going to bring Mr. Duggan. I know we've talked about this a couple of different times. There are a couple different avenues, but there would be a contract that the interim superintendent would need to be under, which would also include a compensation component. So I think ironing those out today would be helpful to move us forward. So everyone is prepared to weigh in and move, once we appoint someone on February, I think it's 7th, I'm sorry, I should have had that written down, that we are in agreement of what that threshold looks like, or at least put a range in place so that that can be negotiated. And Mr. Duggan, I don't know if you have any additional.
No, other than just there's some legal requirements that go into the salary component of this that we can put into a contract pretty easily.
Okay. So hearing or seeing none, I'm believing that there is no additional names being brought forward. So I will, Mrs. Marinelli?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I had received, and I thought that my fellow board members did too, a gentleman by the name of Richard Murphy. So I do not know him. I just read his resume, so I thought it was just prudent that I put that name out there.
Perfect, thank you, and I actually had just written that down. So I had Mr. Richard Murphy had reached out. Again, out of county, I do not know him personally, and appreciate him coming forward and his interest. And then Dr. DePillo and Dr. Foster. I will say there are a lot of people in across the country and even community that are interested. I think that during our search, we'll see a lot of people come forward. I know that there has been a lot of interest in that as well. But from a lockdown aspect, I don't have anyone additional to bring forward either at this moment. So with that, unless there's any additional topics that we want to talk about names, I think that when it comes down to the compensation, so we're prepared for that, there are a couple different philosophies. You could maintain what we had before. I will tell you, our superintendent was our former superintendent was at a relatively higher, substantially higher compensation. We also can consider maintaining or some level of lift. We can't exceed $225,000. I know, Doctor, you have looked into this.
Just, there's a statutory cap of $225,000 with state funds.
State funds.
You can supplement with other funds above that.
Okay. Well, my recommendation would that we would not exceed $225,000 for the interim. I think that we should come up with a range that is reasonable, but I would certainly say not to exceed $225,000 unless there are additional input on that. Seeing none. Okay. Are there any other contractual items that we need to address and get ironed out so that we're clear?
I think you need to have a superintendent and you need to designate a salary are the two basic things that we need to accomplish in the near future. Other than that, it's just different provisions of a contract, which you may or may not decide to agree to, which would be negotiated.
Very well. Do you want to keep the cap at $225,000 or do you want to lower it? Is that okay? So I'm going to then move to the process of the superintendent. Again, historically speaking, doesn't mean that that's the way we have to go down. I would say that it does help to have an independent individual manage certain elements of it. Certainly we are bound by sunshine that there's no communication, but there's a lot of nuances that staff and from communication standpoint, as we work to engage members of the public into this process. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, interest in looking into search firms or consultants and doing an RFP or RFI on that? If there aren't any, I would suggest we do. That's where I'm going to come. I just think we do need to entertain a third-party option. Mr. Enos.
And I would agree. I would say that it needed to be a national search, and based upon that and the total number of people that would like to come to Sarasota and come to the school board, I think that it would be only prudent of us to be able to, instead of to put it on staff, is to be able to use an independent firm. And I would agree to put out an RFI to be able to get to exactly what that would look like, because I think that obviously this needs to be a national search instead of previously, which was just in the state of Florida. I think that a lot of people will have an interest, especially due to the great staff that we have here. And I also, with the transparency in their process and involving citizens and reviews, and I think there's a lot of value in doing exactly what you said, because then I also keep it to the transparency, and it also keeps it to that we rely upon them to assist us in the process.
Okay. In the past, we leaned on procurement or HR or what have you. Mr. Renoff, if you have any insights, because there would be an element of really pushing that out. Is there any insight into, or Mr. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jody.
An RFI would be the appropriate, not RFP, sorry. Which was request for information or qualifications.
So Ms. Penner and I were just having a quick conversation back there, and I think if we could rely on really purchasing Tracy Brizantine and her staff through an RFI process, I think we'll bring out the majority of the firms who are interested in kind of leading you through that process. And I think that would be, once you guys give us the go-ahead, I'm sure Ms. Penner will talk to Ms. Brizantine and get that staff working in that direction. But that, I think, would be the right direction for you.
Perfect, thank you. And then just to move that forward, and this would be under, I don't know, because it's not an agenda item, but is that something we would be able to, we have to put on the February 7th or under interim superintendent new business? Is that something we can?
Yeah, I would put it on the next board meeting.
Okay.
So quick question. I don't think we have to have board action to formally have an RFP process take place. Staff does it all the time. So I think with a nod from the board right now, if that's the direction you want to go in with a timeline, the staff at purchasing can move in that direction. The board would see it at the point when in the process we were evaluating the proposals. But I think if you want to move an RFI process forward, just a head nod from the board could get that moving for you, and get the timelines laid out. And then Ms. Brizantine, as she's done in the past, would certainly come before the board, give you timelines, process, and all that. But just a head nod today could get us started on that.
Mr. Edwards.
I'm completely comfortable. That would have been my suggestion, and it does advance the search sooner than later.
So I'm fine with leaning as we have before. So if we can move that forward and then that all come back to us, I think what we need to do then at this point is almost work from a timeline standpoint, because when you are putting out an would you recommend RFI, request for information, or qualification?
I don't want to
I want both.
stick my foot in, but I would say probably an RFI. RFLOI.
Okay. And so with that, though, as far as the timeline, we have a deadline when you release that and it go out in every channel possible, then what is the closing timeline? I believe that's because we're working backwards. So because we have to not only get those requests, they be brought forward in a workshop to the board for all of us to review because that's the unique part of this is that staff is doing the mechanical component of it, but we are deciding upon those. We're reviewing them ourselves. And so when we get those back so we have a deadline of when we conclude accepting those, then bringing that forward to the board in a streamlined process. So is that, you guys would need that deadline, I guess, is my point.
Yeah, I would suggest that it sounds like we've got direction. We'll move forward. We'll talk with Ms. Brizantine and her staff very quickly and get back to you a proposed timeline with all the I's dotted and T's crossed in place and let you guys take a look at that as soon as possible. That makes sense?
No, it does. Is that acceptable outside of, I just worry that these are not items. This is a unique moment because it is what we do RF, whatever you want, all the other letters. That's usually an administrative process, and because these are board decisions, I want to make sure that we're.
Yeah, I would think the board would want to make sure that you pick which vendor
No.
or third party you're going to use, and I would think that needs to happen at a public meeting, right? So you can vote on it.
That's clear. I'm sorry, let me stop. So I'm talking about the timeline of that. So we want a deadline or bring forward that recommendation. I don't want to delay it anymore, but because it is us making that final decision, is 90 days? No, that's probably too long. Is 60 days? What have you? Or you can provide that information right now, which is usually what you're used to.
Well, let's do this. Why don't we agree that we've got some time today? Maybe Ms. Penner and I could call Ms. Brizantine and see how quickly we can get a timeline from her based on what she's done in the past. Maybe that's something we could have for you later today to have a quick look at. Does that make sense?
Yes, and if you could just, again, in the spirit of transparency and making sure everyone's clear about that, and then you guys get proper direction as far as work, that it being an acceptable timeline. All right? Very good. So outside of that, I think once we hire, or if and when we hire a firm, a lot of times they will help us with timelines and process and communications and all of those things. But just to give, again, this does not have to be, please look at what's happened in the past, what worked, what didn't work. I will say that just in my experience and having heard from multiple board members up here, which I concur with, is including the community. I think what has worked in the past is just, again, thinking ahead. We don't have to finalize these decisions, but having a board sanctioned search committee, meaning that each board member will appoint a certain number of members from the community that, and that is a board sanctioned committee that's fully transparent. They are open. They are part of, they are subject to sunshine and all of that. Again, the search firm can help us figure all those things out, but I would say that I know there have been a lot of questions for the community, so as one board member, that would be my recommendation, regardless of who our consultant / firm is, that be something we continue on. And another thing that we've done in the past that I thought has worked really well, depending on, especially because you don't want to necessarily a huge committee where it's not as functional, but ensuring that there are open, what did we have? Not town halls, but had a open session where members of the community could come and meet with all of the candidates once they were shortlisted. That was two things that I saw that we've done in the past I thought worked really, really well, especially if you have members who, well, whether they're from this community or not, I think it really affords the community an ability to meet the potential candidates, as well as the candidates to really understand our community, hopefully. So those are the main things that I had right off the go. The final thing that I think is really important that was really not discussed in at least that I recall as board members, because we never dealt with it before, but just making sure that everyone understands that the Florida statutes do cap superintendents at $225,000. Previous to our former superintendent, we did not exceed that. Now that's only with, caps with state funding. We have additional, obviously, revenue through our referendum, but I do want to make sure that just thinking ahead, we don't have to decide on that, and working with Mrs. Penner as far as how does that work, even from a contract standpoint, what other revenue streams, because if we're talking about, those are things that we'll have to decide with if we have a third-party independent consultant, what that range is. If we want to be competitive, then we have to make sure we understand that it's not through state funding, and so being prepared to understand what those mechanics look like and where that funding comes from. Those were my big items. Any additional comments from the board? Questions? Thoughts? Oh, we caught up on time. Mr. Renoff, I have to add one more thing. I will tell you that I have heard from not only members of the community, members of staff, members of Department of Education who have just sang your praises. And I genuinely appreciate everything you are. You're a perfect example of. You ask someone to jump and you say how high, and I really appreciate that.
I appreciate that. Thank you very, very much. It's an honor to serve all of you. Obviously, the amazing team that we've got here at the Landings, out in their schools, but this incredible community. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, we have legislative platform at 3. I think that we could probably benefit from a quick break. If someone wanted to do, we'll break for about 20 minutes, and then we will get back to legislative platform, and then we will break for IUPA. Good? Very good.
Testing 1, 2. Megan, you can hear me? You can hear. Okay, are you muted? I can't hear you right now. On, but can't hear her currently.
Well, thank you for working on that. So we're back here at the workshop, and we're going over legislative platform / update. Really briefly, so we had the local delegation meeting, or our local delegation had their meeting last week. To be going back to process, I believe that previously the board really did not have a process identifying a legislative liaison from the board or even from administration to report back to the board, to work with our lobbyists and or what have you. So in addition to that, when the delegation met, there was, back in August, there was a workshop that we had met with our Capital City Consulting lobbyist, and discussed a number of items. The board, it was never brought back to the board to adopt, so nothing could be presented to our delegation. I know there's been a lot of ongoing conversations. I know that each board member has, regularly works with members of our delegation and our community to advocate for those things, but to be able to speak to them, wanting to make sure that we formally adopt it, but because we have new members of the board, may not even be privy to that. So I did speak with Ron LaFace and Megan Fay. Megan Fay is joining us today from Capital City Consulting as our lobbyist, just so she could provide the board an update. We are closing in, fast approaching, session. And so is she, do we have her up, or am I still filling time?
We can't currently hear.
Okay. While we wait for Megan, and when she comes in, we'll just cut off. But one thing that I do think we should do as a board, every year when we go through committees, appointments, or where each board member is sitting on something, is that we designate a legislative liaison that would be working with the lobbyist or with staff, so that, and they can report back to the board, so that it's not just a carte blanche process, and that it's based on a process, because it will help streamline depending on who's in those seats at any given time. Is that agreed upon? Okay.
Okay.
So
you're muted now.
And we'll just wait for Megan. Did everyone get the legislative platform notes that was attached? Yes. If we're still waiting, I was going to have Dr. DePillo come up, but I wanted Megan to chime in. Do you guys have any questions on, these were just initially discussed. Are there any comments or questions? Are these things that we want to formally bring forward so that they can champion them specifically? Many of these are have been brought forward from previous years, particularly number 2, although we're going to strike fully fund, I think. You could talk about that. Number 2, number 3, we can go through these one by one, but she was going to give us an overview and wanted the board to weigh in and then come up with something that we all unanimously agree on. I think these are important to unanimously agree as best as possible, so that our lobbyists and or individually we can work with our delegation and other members of the legislature on behalf of Sarasota County Schools.
Okay, Megan, can I get a quick test now? Yeah, I'm still not hearing you. I know you can hear us. Okay, let me see if I get the number for you to dial in. Oh, you know what? Sorry.
No, you go ahead. So for the time purpose, Dr. Pillow, so I know CTE is a huge area that has been discussed in the past and has been discussed at this board level. So do you want to give us an update on some items?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Board. We have a couple things happening at the state level in terms of career technical education and funding by not only our Chancellor, Kevin O'Farrell, and then the county in our partnership with the Fire Academy. I'll start with the Fire Academy. We did suggest that an appropriation be submitted to the governor and the legislature for an additional $7 million for the Fire Academy project. That's a matching dollar amount to our current funding that the board had previously dedicated to that project. It turns out to be it's over a $40 million project that when we initialized that project, we didn't anticipate the construction cost increased over the last year and a half. That kind of put us way above the number that we thought we would be at in terms of that project. So what we were requesting in that legislative budget request was matching funds of approximately $7 million to help offset those costs. And that went to both Representatives Fiona McFarland and Senator Joe Gruder's office. And that was the email I sent you earlier about prior to break about that request. The other is that Kevin O'Farrell, our Chancellor for CTE in the state, has put forth finally a request from the governor that each of the technical schools be funded at 100% across the state. At the time when we wrote the request, there was 38 school districts funded less than 100% for their workforce education programs. And he's asked for an additional $20+ million be added to the allocation amount so that each of the technical centers would then receive 100% of their calculated amount. And remember, the calculation is based on a previous 3 years average enrollment that has been somewhat detrimental to increased growth for us in terms of funding, because if you go off the prior 3 years and they're always lower than your current year, you're always going to be funded at a lower amount than what you currently have in the system. So I think that's where we're at in terms of asking the legislature for adequate funding and additional funding for projects.
Okay, thank you. Do you guys have any questions on those items while we wait for Megan?
I think she should be able to. No, he's still.
Damn. Mine, yeah. What's happening today? Is it is it a full moon? Like.
You're dialing in. Okay. Yeah, that should be this one. Yeah.
Well, okay, so I'm going to say for the aspect of something that we have done in the past, something I know that the board previously always agreed upon, something I would like to see us champion as a board as well, is item number 2, although the language of fully fund, and I always say fully fund is used too often in education, so when it comes out of the mouth of anyone, sometimes legislators stop listening. So being creative, but understanding what that is, Dr. DePillo has provided us over the years a very thorough and very concise at the same time bullet points on this issue. I know that when I briefly got an update from Megan and Ron, that they are aware of that. The other item is the reemployment after retirement, item number 4. That is something that our lobbyist has been working on for years, honestly, on their own, and have really led the fight for that and made substantial progress. So can we hear her yet? I'm like, just cut me off when you do. But to make this worthwhile time, that would be something I think is very valuable to our operations. And it's again, they can explain it a little bit better. There are some nuances there. It's not an easy slam dunk, but each year there seems to be a little bit more interest. And it sounded like our local delegation is interested in running that through as well. There are a couple other items that were forward over from last year. Those 2 items for me are, I think, the most important, and likely I try to make it narrow, but board members, if you want to chime in, if there are any issues that you want to bring forward, if there are any items on here you do not want.
I'm in full agreement with every item. Well done. Representative McFarland did put forth a bill proposal on the bringing back teachers at one point, so I'm glad that we're still working on that.
Okay. Any other members' comments? Mr. Edwards?
Yes, one of the things that I've been talking about is additional funding for specifically bus drivers, which is nowhere on here
Right.
that I see. And also, since the school district has found a way to sort of find its own supplement for bus drivers, we've done the same thing with ESE, and I think there needs to be an advancement from the state in that particular front as well.
So when they speak, because I did ask them about that on the increased categorical for bus drivers, this is just what we had previously. So, and so I agree with you on that, absolutely. And then just for clarification, are you saying increased categorical for ESC and Title I? Okay, I like that. I like that better than just a blanket 3 increase the BSA. Because every year, has there been a year that they don't say increase the BSA? And I think when we're more targeted and we're able to make that case, I think it's substantially more impactful. And it separates us from, again, same with the fully funding. If we don't have her, I mean, we can, is there any?
We're just gonna check one,
Oh, gosh.
check one more thing and.
Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On number 5, on the mental health funding, where it says, you know, we're going to increase VPK, you know, for additional behavior specialist coordinators and training that includes school guidance counselors. I would like to see, and I know it's going to be a broken record, but increase funds to reduce the counselor ratios, because they are the first line of defense in the mental health for students. And when you've got, you know, one counselor to 800 kids, 600 kids, it's not when the recommended is 1 to 250, which I know we won't get to, but it would be nice if we could put that in there to increase the funding, or however you want to put it. That's not.
I'm going to, let me grab my phone. I think I left it. I'm going to just call her and use the speaker because she does need, I do want her to bring her forward. So 1 second.
I try right now, Megan. Can you hear us? Okay, you can hear. All right.
Yeah, see, it's coming up that she's talking, it just won't.
It just won't come through.
I'm going to see if this works. I don't know what else to do, but
No, I was thinking the same thing.
can you speak?
I can hear you.
Can you guys hear out there? Can you guys hear her?
Hello?
Okay.
Okay, she's coming through now. Yes, we can hear you now. We just lost her again.
What? Wait, she was going.
I'll do it from here. That way you don't have to hold it up.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, let me mute my computer.
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking. If you can give a summary of where we are. I just went over just our 2023. I think you said you could hear me, so I'm not going to repeat myself and use the time for your update.
So I heard bits and pieces of it. I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties. I was sort of on and off. So I don't know exactly where to start. On the mental health, I heard mental health funding, school bus drivers.
Megan, I'll stop. So we went over our 2023, what had been discussed back in August. I updated the board of where that was. We talked about process. That's not really on this topic as far as a liaison, but was mentioned, Dr. DePillo brought forward and discussed the workforce education programs that we have talked about year over year. I brought up and summarized the number 4, provide additional options for their recruitment and retention, which is the retirement component, which you can probably dive into a little bit more. Then Mr. Edwards brought up the increased categorical on bus drivers. I know we discussed that on our call, and something that we did locally here during it's kind of a short stint that has not been discussed before, but with our union was to add an additional funding for ESE certified teachers and Title I teachers, and adding that instead of maybe increase the BSA, because every year that's used and that just falls upon deaf ears, if we could be more targeted of championing increased funding for our ESE teachers and Title I teachers.
That makes perfect sense, and that ties right into the bigger conversation that's certainly happening in Tallahassee around teacher recruitment and retention. But kind of a subset of that discussion is not only that teacher recruitment and retention is an issue, but that there are subsets of teachers like ESD teachers that are harder to recruit and retain. And so I think that certainly makes sense, and it's something that I think we could get some interest in here in Tallahassee if you do decide to adopt that on the platform. In terms of bus drivers, that's certainly also part of the conversation. I know custodians, bus drivers, and food service workers have definitely been part of the conversation too, in terms of being part of the shortage of overall school personnel. To kind of dovetail, I know that the legislature is going to be looking at statewide solutions for shortages and recruitment and retention that will likely be in the guise of additional funding. It is supposed to be a healthy budget year. The state revenues are hitting and exceeding all projections, and so I would anticipate there being additional funding, not only for teacher salaries but for school personnel salaries across the board. But certainly, if the district wants us to put an emphasis on bus drivers, ESE teachers, and Title I schools, that's certainly something we can push for and put to the forefront of our conversations here in Tallahassee. Kind of to talk about the FRS solution, I know which is the retirement issue, that we've come up a couple different years now with sort of different ways to try to attack the issue of letting retired teachers come immediately back to the profession without having to sit out for 6 months. Ron and I have been working on this issue on some language that we thought we had found. We thought we found the silver bullet. There was a law enforcement exemption that, when you read it on the plain language of the statute, I still believe seems to say that law enforcement can come back to be a school safety officer to address that critical shortage within, immediately after retirement. However, I did have a call on Friday with the Division of Retirement, which is a part of the Department of Management Services, and they disagree with the reading. They disagree with my interpretation of the statute, and they still believe that the law enforcement exemption still requires a 6-month sit-out period. And so, that's something that we can continue to have conversations about, but it does not to this point. It does not seem like there is a lot of wiggle room, to get teachers back in the classroom after retirement for within any period less than 6 months. And that is because, for those of you who are new to the board, the IRS essentially has put states on notice that if there is not a bona fide separation of a state employee from the time of retirement to the time they come back into renewed employment, the entire pension fund essentially risks losing its tax exempt status. And so that is something that the legislature, rightfully so, has been hesitant to make changes to. There is no true definition anywhere of a bona fide separation, but 6 months has been sort of the rule of thumb that's been applied, and we've never had an issue with the IRS saying that is a problem. The IRS has essentially said you have to change the law, and then we'll let you know if it's a problem. And obviously, the state legislature has been hesitant to make that kind of change, even though it is something that we've heard from Sarasota schools and school districts across the state that would probably make a difference in helping them retain some teachers that are at that retirement age. They've made the decision to retire, but then maybe wanted to come back because they weren't quite ready. So we'll continue to keep working on those solutions. Representative McFarland and Senator Gruters have filed proposals on this topic in the past, and they've both indicated that they're interested in continuing to work towards solutions, but the solutions have to be workable in the larger scheme of things with the pension fund and the IRS. And so we'll keep having those conversations and looking for creative solutions. But unfortunately, we did get kind of bad news back from the Division of Retirement on Friday. I'll sort of pause there. Chair, would you like me to discuss Mr. DiPillo's proposal for the $7 million in additional CTE funding?
Yeah, he
or-
did summarize when the moment we were trying to, with the technical issues, but before we go there, I wanted to address, Mrs. Marinelli brought up the mental health program funding, and I think it was the ratio, and I think with all of the funding components outside of the line item, but outside of the line item appropriation, because that's more specific, but when we talk about the categorical bus, having a narrative, I mean, but particularly when we talk about the ESC and Title I, I think, Mr. Renoff, or from a staff standpoint, being able to provide any kind of narrative to you guys that would provide helpful stories that why that's so important. So it's not just more money.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Anytime that you can show us this is the amount of money we're currently getting in the categorical for mental health, within that categorical, we're spending this amount of dollars on, counselors, mental health professionals, and then we're spending outside of the categorical our own, base student allocation to supplement, and it's still not enough. Any sort of narrative and data that Ron and I can take to the legislature of why the current categorical does not go far enough is always helpful in making the case that, we're just not coming and asking, hey, we need more money this year, hey, we need more money.
Perfect. Yes. And then the appropriation, and again, Dr. DePillo, and again, for summary, this is regarding the additional funding for the joint, the firehouse, but also the project, the program. So we're with the county and then also the city of Venice, I think, are the three. I don't have a summary up here.
Correct. And so we'll take, of course, if the board decides to vote and include the appropriations request on the legislative platform this year, we'll take the lead and we'll work with members of your delegation to seek, that additional funding. I will say, just to level set, that a $7 million line item appropriation is a very large appropriation, particularly for, members of the legislature, like a member of the House, that might be their entire, allocation that they have for their district essentially for the year. And so it is a large request. And so that would be my only sort of advice as the board is considering whether or not to move forward, is the kind of the scale of that request, and whether or not the larger the request, sometimes the harder it is, to be successful. And so maybe taking a smaller bite at the apple would be something that I would recommend. Typically, a line item appropriation kind of project like that, we would recommend looking, staying around the $1 million mark. I know that's significantly less than the $7 million being requested, and so that's just food for thought. Of course, if the board decides to move forward and adopt the proposal with $7 million as the amount, Ron and I will go forth and we'll work with the members of the delegation to try to be successful.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, Megan, thank you very much for that. And again, I think the amount that was requested was a hope more than it was, and it is a need also, but the hope was that we matched funds that were put up by the district in the city of Venice, and I think that's where the number originally came from. So if it's a strategic move on the part of a lobbyist or somebody has a better lay of the land at the state level, that would be up to the board. And if they are recommending that we have a better chance to get less money than no money, I think we would all say that we take the chance on the higher probability of trying to get a lower amount that's secured than it is to get a zero amount on a larger request. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mr. Edwards?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if our rate of growth in Sarasota is so high. If we had, I appreciate that a member might feel that the $7 million is their district's whole budget, but if our growth is exponentially greater than 90% of the other school districts, it might have validity if we're backing that number up with our rate of growth.
Let me ask you just a timeline standpoint when it comes to appropriations, and because it is such a bulk, and I genuinely don't know this. So when it comes to, like you said, that each member has X amount, if you will, but that there's a preliminary negotiations a lot of times where they're earmarking that. Where are we from a timeline standpoint, Megan? Where, like, if we're talking about what X is the number, not maybe anywhere in between 0 and 7 million, right? What guide us on that, and then the board can decide whether this is something we want to continue with.
Right. So we'll have to have our House Appropriations project request form is going to be a required form that's filled out and filed with the House. That is due. The deadline for those to be submitted is February 13th. So we've got a little bit less than a month to secure a bill sponsor or an appropriation sponsor and have that form filled out. And then our understanding, based on the timeline that's kind of been given to us by the Speaker's office and the President's office, is that appropriations committee chairs are going to roll out their kind of first draft of their particular budgets the third week of session. And so we sort of, we need to hit the ground running. If this is going to be a priority of the school board, we need to start working with, your delegation members to, to get the appropriations project request filed by the 13th of February. And then, it'll be kind of all hands on deck, making sure that we're in that first chairman's proposal the first week or the third week of session, which will be, I think, the end of March, beginning of April.
Right, okay. And then, Dr. DePillo, the county as their own lobbyist, right? And I don't know, Megan, have you worked with Mr. Lewis?
Yeah, we've been
I
in-
am familiar with the county's lobbyist, and I believe that our firm is the lobbyist for the city of Venice. So
Well,
we got a twofer there.
We've been working with the county, and they're very supportive of the project. And Mr. Lewis has been in Tallahassee recently, trying to get the groundwork laid for this appropriation. And we've completed the documents for both Senator Gruder and for Representative McFarland, and they're in their hands of their legislative aides right now. So if we want to make a change, would be probably a good time to make the change prior to the February deadline.
Yeah, otherwise we're not going to have anything. So my colleagues, do you have any thoughts or questions? I think that's a great project. I think there's a reality of what's able to get done. So Megan, I appreciate your feedback on that as far as the amount. I just like any financial request, I think having a story is very helpful. Dr. DePillo, you're good at providing that. But as a board, we haven't discussed this. Is this something we want to add to our legislative platform so that we can move forward? We need to be able to direct our lobbyists and such so that all that can be filed properly. And then also, if we do want to move forward, at what amounts? And are there any thoughts at all? Or are people indifferent? Any comments? Do you need more information? The goal is to summarize a couple bullets so that I can put it back on a board meeting in February, preferably the first meeting, and adopt it so we can have actionable items. But I need direction. Mr. Edwards, thank you. Thank you, I appreciate it, thank you.
You knew it would be me, right? I think Megan's input is essential here in terms of knowing what she thinks she can get into Dr. DePillo's response of some money is better than no money. So I think her input is essential.
Thank you. Megan, do you have perhaps a range or do you need, from a directional standpoint, or do you need to put your feelers out there to figure out, wait, because we don't want to low ball it if we could get more. Perhaps we just get an approval to authorize you to seek out an appropriation with the understanding that we would love $7 million, but if there's more realistic going forward. I mean, we've done that similarly with a request for Summer Learning Academies, put a number out there, but, got something back, but it's better than zero. So can you give us guidance on what you need from a authority standpoint so I can put it in the right posture?
Absolutely. We can certainly do some due diligence and kind of get a feel for what a reasonable number looks like from the perspective of, we can do some due diligence. I would also, I think it'd be great for me to have a conversation with Ron talking about the what we can do, if we were to seek $1 million, what would that fund? Because to your point, we still want to be able to have, we still want to be able to tell a story and have a narrative that supports it. And so, but I think from the perspective of just procedure, I think that if the board just adopts it as a priority, you can probably pick a number. I don't want to be your general counsel and speak to what you need to adopt, actually. But if you give me the authority to move forward, with a range of 0 to 7 million, we can go forth and try to get as much money as possible
Right.
kind of within the parameters of what we think is realistic.
Okay, so Ron, if you can, then I guess my recommendation would be, Ron, if you can provide a summary and connect with Megan. And then Megan, because again, I know Mrs. Goodwin worked predominantly with you guys. If you can, did you draft the language of the summary? I mean, this 2023 language here, was that something y'all have drafted, or because what ultimately I want to make sure so that whatever I get in front of the board is something that they all want to agree on. I think that we would put the project title on there, an appropriation request, then you have a supporting document that the board can be provided, but it may not be on the one pager to legislators, but at least we understand what we're approving. And then including the increased categorical for bus drivers, ESE Title I, the workforce education program. Are you saying we should strike the recruitment, the retirement, or should we, I kind of want to keep it on there, but, or if you think it's not worthwhile, because I think there's strategy not asking for something we know we're not going to get.
I would honestly, my advice would be to keep it on there, just because it is a priority. It's important to the district, which is, I wanted to provide that context with the understanding that, we're still working with staff and with the members for a solution, but I'm just not sure we're going to find a solution, if I'm being perfectly honest. So, but if it is important to the school board, I would recommend, if that's the will of the school board, voting to keep it on there, just so you indicate that it is a priority.
I'd like to keep it on unless there's any objections. And what I will do for the sake of time, because I know we have a 3:30, is to summarize, unless there are any items that were brought up that anyone's opposed to, because I don't want to. So the increased bus, the categorical for bus, ESE, and Title I, the workforce education programs for adjusting the three rolling average, the striking base BSA, because we're doing that through the categoricals, the retirement, and then the mental health funding based on the ratios, and we'll have staff work on that from the narrative standpoint. Megan, I'll connect with you so we can draft the right thing that I can add it to by Thursday of this week. So is next week, excuse me, by Thursday of next week, so it can be added to our agenda for February 7th. Are there any comments, questions, or objections? Seeing none, thank you so much. I appreciate you jumping on, and I will be in touch.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Sorry
you.
for the technical difficulties.
Very good. Okay, so we have a 3:30 with IUPA, so we will be adjourning and moving to, I believe it's 3:15, or are we meeting in here? 3:15. So we are adjourning and going into executive session for negotiations with IUPA, our law enforcement union. And yes, and we will be back here to conclude and wrap up the workshop with additional comments from board members. but in the sake of time, are there any member comments? Mr. Edwards, I'll start with you.
Yes, a topic that I have been working on as an individual board member is affordable housing, and I'd like to continue that conversation in a workshop.
Okay.
In our last conversation, we had a real loose conversation about the desire to desire town halls. And delineating what's the difference between a town hall and public comments. And I'd be willing to answer questions myself as a board member. So if all board members would agree to that, I think we should all answer to the public and answer questions that they may have for us. So I think that's just feedback I would give to my fellow board members.
I'm sorry, just for clarification, you mean like during a town hall?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, okay, perfect. Yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
In talking about Schumacher and Ms. Rose's perception that that somehow there was an agreement to put Patrick onto the dais, when I got that call I got a phone call the day of the swearing in, and Patrick had indicated to me that he had spoken to 3 board members, and 3 board members made the decision to put him on the board or at the dais. At the time, there were only 3 board members because the other 2 hadn't been sworn in. So I did not get that call as an inquiry about can Patrick be on the board. I was told Patrick was going on the board.
May I?
Well, I will actually answer really quickly. From what I know is that, what are we going on to November 22nd? Mr. DeLeo, I believe, had previously already sent an email.
Yes.
And Shoemaker is our contract.
Yes.
I know specifically, I said I am indifferent. We just need to have counsel. So
Yeah.
if that clarifies
Well,
anything.
prior to Mr. DeLeo, Mr. McKinley was on the dais, and that had been established. And then on the morning of the 22nd, I was called and told that 3 board members had been consulted, of which I was only one of the 3. And I wasn't consulted, I was told. So I don't care where it ends up. What I'm trying to say is that the clarity that Ms. Rose seems to have that Mr. Duggan belongs there, I don't have. So
I'm not sure why you keep referencing me or have a need to, or create a narrative that becomes a fact. Absolutely, that could be a fact for you, but it doesn't make it a fact for anyone else. Let me finish, please.
I don't think
Let me finish,
the
please.
chair had given you the floor.
Okay, if Mrs. Rose, wrap up, and then, because I think Mr. Edwards had some other items as far as topics, if you do it just for clarification.
When my name is consistently brought out, I think I have an opportunity to respond. I had no conversation that you're referencing. My knowledge of Mr. Duggan being on this board came from Mr. DeLeo and from Shoemaker. So when you are continually putting things out to the public, which you are doing, which do not show unity on this board, I am going to state it does not match my reality.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. Before I was interrupted, I was going on what, if anyone wants to roll the tape, what Mrs. Rose said today. Not anything about the 22nd. What she said today was that Mr. Duggan is on the dais. She said that today. And that is not my perception. So I'm not accusing anybody of anything, and I'm not misusing anyone's name. I'm just trying to get clarity. And I do have more things.
Go ahead.
It was not my intention when we created the ESC supplement and the Title I supplement that Oak Park would be excluded. That was not my intent. And so somehow those folks who, in my opinion, should be compensated equally are not. And whatever we have to do to correct that is something that I would like to talk about. If we need to create an Oak Park supplement, I'm okay with that, and I think we should. I'm reminding you that we were going to talk about the healthcare academies and the STC build-out. And lastly, because of where we are today, I think it's important that the public know that on October 27th, there was a parent-teacher conference at Laurel Nokomis at which a board member and a board member-elect went to that conference. And I think that's against procedure. That's just my personal opinion. And regardless, because employees are nervous based upon the recent termination of our superintendent, that we clear that up, because that happening caused a lot of fear. Now we've got this other situation on top of that, and I'd like to discuss it just so that we can fix that anxiety.
Thank you very much. Just to really quickly note, and then I'll go through the other board members that wanted to respond. I have there were 3 items from the former workshop discussion that to bring forward for a workshop. As you can see, this one was pretty packed, but looking ahead, and Mrs. Tompkins and I have already looked at those for the upcoming workshop, so they are not forgotten, as well as and then also the legal contract to clear up this confusion. To bring forward a language that will provide some clarity so that we can make a formal action item on it must be done by February 7th to provide some clarity. Moving on, I have all the rest of the notes. Mr. Enos, do you have any comments? I was just going to go down if that's okay.
No comments. The 2 things I was going to follow up on due to the delays today will push to the next workshop in regarding to the parents coming on campus, and I did do some research and met with the chief and the school safety specialist, as well as called a national expert as myself in regarding to that, and then also in regarding to looking at the parent liaison to the board, again, for some of the transparency piece.
Perfect. And the only thing I'd recommend is if there's any kind of either framework or draft language that it be added in advance and sent either Mr. Duggan or Mr. McKinley or Mr. Eno, however, but that we have Mrs. Tompkins be provided some kind of framework of it so that we can work off of that. Next is Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to follow up with what Tim said about the parent liaison or a liaison on the board, don't we have a liaison, a parent liaison currently on staff that works with Dr. Moore? I mean, is that something that
parental engagement is
He's
the
family engagement.
Family engagement.
Yeah, and the only reason I say that is he mentioned it to me that would be something he would be interested in. I guess I'll turn that over to the superintendent, but that maybe we have already somebody on staff that's doing some things and would like to.
Yeah, I think what would help is maybe if we identify the framework and what the liaison, because those words mean what the actionable item is, and then certainly the job, what is currently being taken place, and then no need to duplicate if they can be expanded, but that what goal we're trying to achieve through that, and then whether we need to evaluate a different.
And he just brought it up to me. I wouldn't even realize. So I'm not trying to add more work for him. So, but also I wanted to bring up, we're in a very unique situation. We have our executive director of exceptional student education retiring. And, that's going to be, it's going to be a loss. I mean, we've Mrs. Alberts has really, been part of the school community, the community for many, many years. Why I'm bringing this up, I would like to suggest to my fellow board members and the superintendent that we have a consultant come in and talk with all of our teachers, take a look how the whole ESE classrooms are structured. Do the teachers feel like they have the supports they need? Because it's such a huge department, and this is they can work with Mrs. Alberts and work with our staff, because I think if to move forward, this is a real unique opportunity to really work with parents, work with staff. and bring in the best person we can to go through with those recommendations and give the best education we can for a wide variety of students.
No, yes, thank you. Mr. Renoff, I see people, I see your hands before I see it on the queue.
Sorry,
Did you
just
want
wasn't sure.
Go,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I do appreciate you bringing that forward. With change does come opportunity. And, again, Ms. Figueredo, Alberts, I mean, that is a huge, huge job and a lot of responsibility. There's no question about it. We want to make sure we do our due diligence in working with Ms. Alberts, her team, but also HR. We've started to work backwards with regards to potential timeline for posting, et cetera. When you start backing things out, looking at whether it's an internal person, external person, interviews, somebody time to give notice if they're working somewhere else, et cetera, should all that be considered? Basically, it looks like if we're going to have some overlap responsibly, approximately a month, not 3, 4, 5 months. But I do think it's, important that we do have some overlap there. We're looking at a posting of mid-February. So again, if there's a way that we could go ahead and get some stakeholder feedback, I do think that's incredibly valuable. So again, I'd love to have some further conversation about that.
I appreciate that, and I would say Mr. Renoff, I know, brought something forward earlier about this because understanding it is such a huge opportunity and a huge area of interest, and certainly been ongoing discussion. And so I appreciate kind of working through that time frame, and I would love to see us engage stakeholders or specialists, because I think that in order to set it up for great success, I don't want it to lag on to the time frame of it, but I know we have many people in our community that are very engaged in the exceptional student education. If there is an actual consultant, I'm not familiar with that. Mrs. Rose.
I just want to make a request for a workshop item sometime in the future, particularly after the progress monitoring, state progress monitoring results are complete, that we focus in on the pre-kindergarten program, what is happening in those, the success with achievement, needs, funding, because that's a new piece and a real important piece. Okay. If it's the will of the board, please.
Thank you. I have I know a lot of my comments actually came out during the budget, which was supposed to be a short workshop, but a lot of it lined up with that, and that is also where I think we could bring forward the VPK. You're talking about progress monitoring, but also the funding aspect of that. I think looking at all the grants and the positions and programs, I think that'll help us clarify a lot of things as well. So definitely no shortage of topics for upcoming meetings or workshops. I think that when it comes to going back to the ESE director position, I will defer to Mr. Renoff, but I think that I know as one board member and hearing from others tonight or today that however we can lift that up to a community involvement which is unique when we talk about an executive director position, but given the historical interest in that area and the importance of that role. Mr. Edwards.
Yeah, I just want to, since the timing of the posting is imminent, I don't know, I mean, just because we've been doing it a certain way, it is the opportunity to look at it. So I don't think it's a bad idea. I just don't know, do we have to post at that time frame? Can we have an acting in the meantime? I mean, what are our options?
Yeah, I think go ahead.
And then just, I think it takes priority of all of the things that I've heard so far to get it on a discussion.
Yeah, I think what I would love to do is have some additional conversation both with Ms. Alberts, a couple of members on her team, and also folks from our HR department to go look at options moving forward.
Yeah. No, and so we can bring that. Okay, perfect. So I already really worked through my items. I think that we've had a lot today, so thank you for that. And we will adjourn and reconvene tonight at 6 p.m.